All right, let's dive right into the engine of the global economy, international trade. Welcome to this explainer, where we are going to completely demystify this incredibly complex system. You know, we see goods from all over the world on our store shelves every single day, right? But the underlying mechanisms of exactly why and how they get there, it is absolutely captivating.
To kick things off, let's pose a question that honestly seems a bit counterintuitive at first glance. Why does a country buy products from abroad that it could easily just make itself? I mean, if a nation has the factories, the natural resources, and the workers to produce something right at home, why spend the money importing it from halfway across the globe? Keep that little knowledge gap in the back of your mind, because answering it unlocks the entire logic of global trade. So here is our roadmap for today. First up, why countries trade. Second, the comparative advantage twist. Third, the benefits of free trade. Fourth, the terms of trade. And finally, real-world limitations. Starting with Section 1, why do countries actually trade in the first place? It all comes down to factor endowments. At the absolute most fundamental level, international trade exists because countries simply have different resources. Economists call these factor endowments. Basically, it is way easier to move finished good across a border than it is to move land, natural resources, or an entire workforce. Take Zambia, for example. Zambia supplies a whole range of products, but copper accounts for more than 70% of their total export revenue. Why? Well, they have an obvious natural advantage: massive natural copper deposits. But it's not just the rocks in the ground. Over time, they've built up secondary advantages. Their mining equipment uses the latest tech, and their miners are incredibly experienced and well-trained. So this unique mix of factor endowments makes them highly efficient at producing copper. Now, when we talk about this kind of efficiency, we really have to draw a hard line between two different frameworks: absolute advantage and comparative advantage. Absolute advantage is super straightforward. It just means a country can produce more of a product using the exact same amount of resources as another country. Comparative advantage, though, that is a bit more nuanced. It means producing a good at a lower opportunity cost, meaning you give up less of another product to make it. Locking in this mental model is absolutely crucial for the rest of our explainer. Let's look at absolute advantage in action. Imagine that before any kind of specialization, Indonesia produces 500 tons of rice and Brazil produces 500 tons of coffee. Indonesia is naturally better at growing rice, and Brazil is naturally better at growing coffee. They each have an absolute advantage. But if they go all in and completely specialize in their natural advantage, look what happens. Indonesia produces 1,000 tons of rice and Brazil produces 1,000 tons of coffee. Boom! Total world output increases drastically. By sticking to what they do best and trading, both countries end up consuming way more than they ever could alone. Which brings us to Section 2, comparative advantage, the real twist here. What if a country is better at making absolutely everything? Should they still trade? Let's compare the USA and Bangladesh in producing coats and shirts. Say the USA can produce 4,000 coats and 10,000 shirts. Bangladesh can produce 1,000 coats and 8,000 shirts. The USA is undeniably more efficient at producing both items, right? They hold an absolute advantage in coats and shirts. You might think the USA should just isolate itself and make everything at home, but let's look a little closer at the math. Here is the secret. It's not about speed or absolute numbers. It is all about opportunity cost. It's about what you have to sacrifice. If the USA decides to make a coat, they have to pull resources away from making shirts. Specifically, they give up 2.5 shirts for every single coat they make. But Bangladesh, they have to give up a massive 8 shirts to make just one coat. Because the USA gives up fewer shirts to make a coat, the USA actually has the comparative advantage in coats. Even though they are faster at making shirts too, Bangladesh's inefficiency in shirt making is relatively lower than their inefficiency in coat making. So if the USA specializes in coats and Bangladesh specializes in shirts, total global production goes up and everybody wins through trade. To pull this math out of the textbook and into the real world, let's talk about Peru. Peru has a ridiculously powerful comparative advantage in producing fish meal, which is heavily used in agricultural feed. Why? Because of highly fertile fishing grounds along their coast, fueled by the Peru current and the El Niño effect. Plus, they have a long tradition and highly skilled workers dedicated to this specific process. They give up very little in terms of other economic activities to produce massive amounts of high-quality fish meal, making them a major global exporter. It is genuinely impressive how effectively they leverage their environment. Moving into Section 3, the benefits of free trade. Why bother liberalizing trade at all? Why does this matter to us, the everyday consumers, or the average business owner? Removing trade restrictions has some massive upsides. First off, it leads to a much better use of global resources, which bumps up global employment and living standards. Secondly, it injects fierce competition into the market. And we all know competition forces businesses to lower prices and improve quality. Third, domestic firms get access to cheaper raw materials and machinery from the most efficient global producers. And fourth, by selling to a massive global market, businesses achieve economies of scale. Producing in bulk lowers their average costs and naturally boosts their profits. And this is the ultimate magic trick of macroeconomics. Without trade, if a country is producing both clothing and food, it hits an absolute ceiling, a hard limit of what its own resources can provide. Let's call it 40 million units of clothing and 20 million units of food. But if that country fully specializes in clothing, which it's highly efficient at, and then trades some of it away for food at a favorable exchange rate, their consumption breaks right through that ceiling. They literally get to consume 40 million units of clothing and 30 million units of food. Trade allows a nation to consume way beyond its own physical production capabilities. Section 4. The terms of trade. Basically, the international scorecard.
So how do we actually know if a country is getting a good deal in these global exchanges? Well, economists use the terms of trade index. You calculate it by taking the index of export prices, dividing it by the index of import prices, and multiplying by 100. In plain English, it just measures the relationship between the money a country earns from selling its exports versus the money it has to shell out to buy its imports. If the index rises, that's a favorable movement. The country can buy more imported goods using the same amount of export revenue. If it falls, it's deteriorating. They have to sell more of their own goods just to afford the exact same amount of imports.
If we look at how this actually plays out over a 17-year stretch, the contrast can be pretty jarring. Take Australia. Their terms of trade surged upward. They experienced a highly favorable improvement, meaning the global prices for their exports were rising way faster than the prices of the goods they were importing. But then look at Pakistan. Their terms of trade essentially flatlined and saw a steady decline. They were working just as hard, perhaps producing just as much, but their actual purchasing power on the global stage was shrinking. A huge reason for Pakistan's struggle, and honestly the struggle of many developing nations, is explained by the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis. This theory suggests that as global incomes rise, people demand more fancy manufactured goods, like smartphones and sports cars, but they don't demand proportionally more basic crops or timber, right? Because of this, over time, the prices of manufactured goods tend to rise much faster than the prices of raw materials. So countries that only export primary products often watch their terms of trade naturally deteriorate over the years. Finally, Section 5, real-world trade limitations. Because eventually, the textbook models have to meet reality. While the math of comparative advantage is literally flawless on paper, the real world is incredibly messy. We can break down this friction into 3 main limitations. Step 1, high transport costs. Even if a country has a comparative advantage, if it costs an absolute fortune to ship the goods across an ocean, that advantage vanishes instantly. Step 2, protectionism. Governments often step in and completely ruin the free trade math by slapping tariffs, quotas, and sanctions on imports to protect their own domestic industries. And step 3, immobile resources. The model just assumes that if a country stops making shirts and focuses on coats, the workers will easily switch jobs. But in reality, a shirt maker can't just magically become a coat maker overnight if they lack the skills. This causes very painful structural unemployment in the real world. Which leaves us with a pretty massive final question to ponder. As the climate changes and economies shift around us, will your country keep its comparative advantage? A country's factor endowments are definitely not permanent. Take Mauritius, an island nation that grew its tourist visitors from a mere 18,000 in 1970 to 1.5 million by 2020. They have a massive comparative advantage in tourism thanks to a beautiful subtropical climate and stunning beaches. But what happens if sea levels rise or extreme weather disrupts that exact climate? Their natural advantage could literally be washed away. Comparative advantage is a constant fluid competition, and nations absolutely must adapt or risk being left behind in the global economy. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep looking for the hidden economics in the everyday products all around you.